Good morning. We'll be starting here in just a few minutes on what is at least a nice snowy day here in Ithaca. While you're waiting, you might want to go ahead and open up your pods, your Q&A pod, your chat pod, and get ready to do polls on Poll EV. We'll talk about those a little bit more, but you can go ahead and get ready. We'll be starting up here in about a little over a minute, minute and a half. Okay, we're going to give folks about 30 seconds to finish logging in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. But again, you might want to go and open up your pods, Q&A pod, your chat pod, and get ready to answer polls with Poll EV. We're going to do that throughout this webinar today. Hey, my clock is actually correct. Always good. I had a Lewis Carroll clock for a little. Okay, so good morning and welcome to one of our foundational webinars. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the Corner Local Routes program. We're your New York State LTAP Center, and we're about halfway through our winter schedule here. Today we're going to be talking about drainage law. Now, we only have 1 hour together, and so we're going to limit what we can talk about, but hopefully we'll have a little bit of fun. We'll get started here. And just so you know, we're going to be doing polls, so make sure you log that in. Okay. So in terms of our foundational webinars, we did do some in the fall back in November, December, but we'll be continuing with these all the way into early March, and then we'll be starting our spring workshop series. Several of them we'll talk about today that you might find interesting. And then just as an extra aside, if you're interested, we have some work zone workshops that are starting actually next month in February and March that are covered by a grant. So the cost for those is essentially you having to register. Some of them are getting close to being waitlisted, so sign up soon. And if you are a winner of one of the packages, please make sure you're signed up. Now, in terms of our webinars, if you haven't been on one of these before, your audio settings are down the lower left. If you have any questions or concerns, open up your Q&A and you can put a question or concern in there, and I may be asking you some questions. So make sure that pod's open. And you're also going to want to open up the chat pod, because in the chat pod, we'll put in a couple of times a link to a handout, which has a whole bunch of references. That's really the value of it, and a list of all of our webinars, as well as links to things like Poll EV, so you don't have to type those things in. And I may ask you to raise your hands a few times during the day as well. This particular webinar is worth 1 PDH, Professional Development Hour for engineers in New York. Only the person registered gets it, and it is considered a course for those who care. Now, what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to start a little bit about why drainage is important and why drainage law starts to make a difference in terms of what we need to be able to do. We'll talk a little bit about drainage law, where it comes from in New York State, some rights and responsibilities for highway officials, the right-of-way, which turns out to be a pretty important issue when it comes to drainage law, and then just finish up a little bit of time on getting permission. Can't get into a lot of depth, but hopefully we'll get you started if you have any questions, and we'll give you some time to ask any questions that you've got as well. Now, caveat, I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV. I'm an engineer by trade. Okay, I know a lot more about highway law than I ever thought I would know in drainage law, but a lot of the materials that we're talking about today are things I've picked up, and it's my perspective from an engineering perspective. Now, the materials we're going to use, a lot of them come from resources that are available through the LTAP Center, so you may want to download them. There are links, link to our publications page. You can download any of these workbooks. There's rights and responsibilities of local highway officials, roadway and roadside drainage, and stormwater management. Those are all workshops. And then we also have a drainage law on drainage situations and problems in New York State, which was written by Darryl Harp, who used to be the chief counsel for New York State DOT. And a lot of what we're talking about today comes from that particular workbook that's up on our website. Now, to help me out and see who's on our list of folks, we have a good crowd here today, probably because it's snowing and you're not outside. Let's do a little bit of a welcome using the polls. So it's pollev.com/DavidOrPE. And I just want to get a sense of who you're with and where you're from. And some of you have already started putting those answers in. We had tested this out, so it was active. So who do you work for? We have somebody working for the weekend. That's always good. But we have a nice blend. We have town, we have county, we have city and village, we have state and fed. Don't have any tribal today, but we have some consultants. Okay. Okay, that's good to see. Okay. What is your job? What is your role? Are you an administrator, an engineer? Are you a highway superintendent, a planner? Are you in the field? Are you a supervisor, elected board member? None of the above. And if you put none of the above, do me a favor and throw what you are into the Q&A so I can get a sense of what that is. And again, because of PDHs, I'm not surprised that 3/4 of you are engineers by trade. That's cool. Okay, nobody, we have one H, but nobody put in what that is. Okay, cool. And then how long have you been there? Are you brand new, less than a month on the job, less than a year, 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5, and then of course all the way up to 20 plus? So about a quarter of you each for 3 to 5, 5 to 10, and 20 plus, and we have one person less than a year. Okay. My goal here is to have you pick something up, and that can be very helpful. And we have planning zone member there. Okay, good to know. So where are you from around the state? There are some differences, not so much in the law, but in terms of how things work out. And we'll talk a little bit about something called MS4s, and that matters. We have somebody who's over near in Connecticut. Oh, cool. Nobody in Lake Ontario today. Yeah, that's good. I like that. It's a nice variety of folks all over the state. Okay. Now, we may not be able to answer your question, but just from the standpoint of why you're here today, in one word, we're going to create a little wordle. What is your biggest drainage law concern? And again, if you can't access the poll EV, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A so we get those answers and we can deal with that. But I want to see what your concerns are because I want to modify things a little bit based upon what you're saying. Okay, so liability is kicking today. Wow, okay, that's really, really hitting a lot. Right of way, well, we'll definitely talk about right of way. Okay. Runoff rules and discharge rules, who has that responsibility? That's good. I have right of way, private easements, liability also in the Q&A. Okay. Okay, that gives me a good sense of what we're going to do. So we're going to focus a little bit on the liability, right of way, which we'll definitely do, and who has responsibility for discharge, stormwater, and I do see MS4 in there as well. Okay, cool. Okay, that's actually very helpful. Thank you. Now, we said we're going to start with why drainage is important. What you all know, you've heard me say this before, if you've been on any of my webinars, there's only 3 things that matter in building a road: drainage, drainage, and drainage. And if you look back a little over 100 years ago, roads outside of urban areas didn't look very good. They were muddy messes. And we've done a lot better job, but we got to deal with water. Water is not our enemy, by the way. It's excess water that's the enemy. This is a picture taken by a gentleman by the name of Jay Olson, and we give him credit for taking and sharing the picture. And his quote on the bottom is pretty important, and that's: drainage is critical for roadway design. Ducts are an indicator of poor drainage. If you've got ducts able to live on the side of the road, you probably have some excess water. And remember, excess water is the thing we have to worry about. And why does it matter in terms of drainage law? Well, once that water starts getting out of control, it isn't in a controlled form, it makes a big difference. What happens when you get a plugged up culvert? Whose responsibility is it? Is it the highway department? Is it the landowner? Where does that responsibility stop? And then of course, who has to repair and pay for the damages that occur? You know, if you see an old bridge like this one, big double box culvert, which these he would prefer you not to have. We'll talk about that a little bit. But when you get this debris, who's going to clean it up? What do you do about the debris coming down? Whose responsibility is that? These are all things that come into a legal aspect, and of course, liability, as y'all put onto the wordle that we've got. In an urban area where you've got stormwaters and storm sewers, you've got to worry about your system and what happens when it first flushes. What do you happen during a storm event? What happens if it gets plugged up by somebody else's debris? In this case, it was from a construction site on the left, actually plugged up the catch basin somewhere, actually the pipe between 2 catch basins. So how do you clean that out properly? And you're going to have to deal with the storm sewer system, and that can be an issue to deal with. Then we can get issues where we have a stream that gets out of its banks and it starts to threaten the roadway. And what can we do legally here, and what do we have to do in the way of both permitting and to make sure the problem doesn't come back? And I'll give you a hint, by the way. Don't just go in there and straighten the stream out. That would actually be one of the worst things you can do, would actually make the problem worse. When we have a farm field or just any field or land where it intersects with the highway, how do we bring water from the private onto the public right-of-way? And if we can do that in a coordinated way, we're all going to be better off, but we know that doesn't always happen. If we create our own problems, we have to deal with our own consequences. If we don't take care of erosion, if we don't take care of where the water is flowing, we may be responsible. And these are all drainage law issues that we're going to have to deal with. So that's our goal today. We're going to be talking about all of these things and hopefully give you some insight so you handle water in a better way. And I have good news for you, however, that it turns out that there's actually a pretty cool rule that we can use that saves us most of the time. So now, first wordle that's a question inside, not just a welcome, that is, New York State drainage law is derived from which of the following? Common law, civil law, reasonable use, or none of the above? Okay, not what it is today, but where does it come from? Okay, so in the United States, we have two choices for drainage law. Okay, you can keep answering while I go on, but you can have common law and you can have civil law. Common law essentially says, if you read the bottom line, it says water is a common enemy. And that means you can do with water whatever you want on your own property. You can discharge it, you can retain it, you can do whatever you want. It's a common enemy, and we treat it as such. And in that particular case, if you wanted to just discharge water onto somebody else's property, you would actually have the right to do that. So when the Grand Teton Dam failed in Idaho, which was a common law state, they could say, well, we just decided we didn't want that dam anymore, and we're just discharging it. Now, obviously, that's not reasonable. Nobody would expect that that's a reasonable activity, and the courts would have definitely ruled against that. New York State, by the way, is a common law state. Our laws came from the common law. Okay. Now, there is another law in the United States called civil law. That means you're supposed to be civil to your neighbors. You're never supposed to change anything because that's not being neighborly. And so therefore, theoretically, after Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana, which is a civil law state, Louisiana and Maine, the ones with French connections, they could have done nothing. And that's not reasonable either. And in every single state, the law now has gone towards reasonable use. Between court cases and judge decisions and attorney generals and comptrollers, the idea is reasonable use. You can probably do it if you're reasonable about it. And that works 95% of the time. I'd love to say 100, but remember, there's conflicts and there's still court cases that are involved. Now, one place where we create a lot of problems for ourselves is understand the difference between surface water drainage and a natural water course. Okay, a natural water course, a stream like you see in the photograph, has a different set of rules than surface water drainage. And when it comes to surface water drainage, like off of a roadway, off of a house, off of a yard, the question one has to ask is it natural or is it man-made? And this creates all kinds of chaos for people. If it's natural, the rules are different in terms of drainage law than if it's man-made. If it's man-made, you have to control and take care of that water until it gets back to a natural water course and isn't creating any problems for that natural water course, okay? Now, what is man-made? Well, that's where the court cases come into play, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but just realize that if it's natural, you can probably do almost anything because it's considered part of nature, okay? Now, if you're in an urban area, it's usually pretty easy. You've got storm sewers, you've got lots of impervious surface, you've concentrated and increased the peak flow. Almost assuredly, that's going to be considered man-made waters, whether it's from the surface or even in the natural water course. It's no longer a natural water course at that particular point. So in that case, any water in a storm sewer system, you have to essentially control it until it is dissipated back into a natural environment. And that means you don't want to have erosion, you don't want to have extra pollutants. There's all kinds of things you have to worry about there. So one of the questions that comes up then is, is putting a culvert in. Is that a natural water course or is that a man-made water course? So I'm going to ask you to raise your hands, okay? And I've got your question. I'll come back to the question there, Paul, in a minute. But I want you to raise your hand if you think that stream is man-made flow. Is that man-made flow? Raise your hand if you think it's man-made flow. Let's see how many people raise their hand. Okay. A lot of you think that's man-made flow. Okay. Now, I'm assuming the rest of you think it's not man-made, but let's just confirm this. Watch this trick. My hands are up. Hands are up. All the hands are going to get lowered magically. Watch this. Jody and Amanda in the background magically lower your hands. Now, everybody who thinks that's a natural water flow, raise your hand. Everybody thinks that's natural flow, raise your hands. A lot more of you. Yeah, and actually, a lot of you didn't vote. And guess what? You're probably somewhat, every one of you has some good arguments to be made, and we'll talk about that. But most of the time, if a culvert's been there for a long period of time, it's considered a natural water course. Okay? If you don't have records of when it was installed, and it's been there as long as anybody can remember, the courts have generally said, yep, that's a natural water course. However, any damages that were caused by putting it in, you're still liable for, okay, within the general vicinity of where the culvert is. But replacing a culvert pipe with a new culvert pipe, as long as you do it in a reasonable way, it's considered natural water, and some of the rules about natural water courses come into play. Could you create water in a culvert situation? Possibly, but most of the time, the courts have said, no, that's just a culvert. It's not changing things that much, okay? Storm sewers are different, and where does the line draw between the two? That's why it's not 100% for reasonable use, okay? Now, here's a good question. We've got a question there about, what about neighbors who change grades and how surface drainage that never occurred before? I want to leave that question active. It's a good one, and we will come to it, I promise. But let's talk first about replacing the culvert, okay? So we got a culvert washed out during a big rain event, hurricane actually. I can't remember if it's Irene or Lee. Pipe is actually big enough to handle the design storm. Could the municipality reset that pipe without a permit? True or false? Can you answer the question? Could the municipality reset the pipe without a permit? True or false? By the way, I'm only giving you two choices. I should give you a third. So about 3/4 of you are saying true, about 1/4 of you are saying false. What I should have given you is a third choice, of course, which is depends. Okay. Depending on the stream, you probably can replace it, but certain streams you'll probably have to get a permit. If you declare it to be an emergency situation, and yeah, I think that's an emergency situation, you could still replace it without the permit, but you still need to think about the same requirements as if you were getting a permit, okay? So in terms of bank full, in terms of discharge, in terms of things that you're going to be doing, okay? So yes, most of the time you probably could, but again, are you being reasonable about the replacement? Are you making sure you're not creating an erosion problem downstream? Are you dealing with any changes in flow that have occurred since the pipe was put in the first place? So these are things that you need to be asking yourself. Now, I don't know if you've not seen this yet or not. It is available on the DEC website. You may want to review this. It is not yet an official set of guidance, but I will tell you, this is out there. Public comment period is already over. We'll see what actually gets promulgated. But they have some draft guidance for the review of bridge and culvert projects where there's a DEC permit needed. And they're actually, first off, they're preferring bridges and open bottom box structures, a natural bottom, either an arch or a bridge. Four-sided boxes are okay, but they'd like to have it embedded, where since you've got fill above the top of the bottom, unlike we saw in that aluminum box. Elliptical or squashed, and then round is actually the least preferred of all of those. And the reason for that is that they want to make sure there's connectivity. Aquatic animals can get through, lizards can get through, even just mammals can get through, and it's harder and harder for them to do that the more man-made the bottom is, the more like a round pipe. The other one that is going to come up, and a lot of you may have heard about, comes back to the size of the pipe. So do you know the design storm you use for your crossroad culverts? Can you tell me that? Okay. Okay. So let's see what y'all have for your design storm. And somebody asked a good question about increasing the size of a culvert during an emergency. Absolutely. You probably should be thinking about making it larger to handle the design storm that it needs to handle. If it can already handle your design storm, then you can put it back. But otherwise, yeah, you might need to make it larger. That's a very good question. And I see somebody put in two different answers. And the reality is you might have different standards for your crossroad culverts. Maybe some roads are more critical than others. Okay. And the reason I put this out there is part of this draft guidance has some rules about pipe sizes and bridge sizes. Okay. That's important to know. Now, you probably have seen the fact that we already have a requirement in place on certain streams that any culvert that's put in is 1¼ times bank full width. And there's definitions about bank full width, but essentially think about something with a floodplain. The pipe needs to be 1/4 larger than that to try to keep it as natural as possible. The new standards 1.5 is preferred and it may be required for certain critical bridges. I've read through it. I'm not quite convinced I've got my brain wrapped around what critical bridges are, but it's something to think about. Slopes should all be under 3%, especially if there's a bottom in it. The key is there aquatic organism passage or AOP, connectivity and continuity, okay? Now, in terms of sizes, bridges, i.e. 20 foot or above, 1% or 100-year storm with 3 feet of freeboard, which can be, I think, a challenge for a lot of us. Okay. For culverts, they're actually looking for a 2% storm or a 50-year storm, if you're more familiar with that, with a modification of at least 110 or maybe even 120% of the flow. And they want 2 feet of freeboard during that design storm. So the days of designing it for freeboard with a 10-year storm and check it for a 50-year storm or 10% to 52% storm, they would like to see a 2-foot freeboard in every single cases. It's not just scour critical, as the person put in the QA. There's a little bit more than that at certain stream types that also come into play, like trout streams and Class A streams and things like that. But yeah, scour critical is listed as well. But there are some things you're going to be thinking about, and you're probably going, wow, this seems like a lot, and it could be, and we may be turning a lot of culverts into bridges. But there are some special considerations. You may want to look and review that. For instance, if you're on a very low volume road, you may be able to use the standards that we developed, apply them, and keep pipes the same sizes that are in there, which slightly smaller 25-year events, 4% storms would be allowed in a lot of cases, or for driveways. Okay. Again, exactly what's going to get promulgated, I'm not finally sure, but it is something you want to keep in the back of your head. And we'll probably wind up doing some additional stuff on the next time we run this webinar or similar webinars. Now, in terms of why all this matter from a drainage law standpoint, well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to not have floods like this. What we're trying to do is have water be as natural as possible, but we also know no matter what, we're going to have events. We're going to have flooding events. We know there's evidence there's going to be more flooding events, so just something that you need to keep in mind in terms of where you're going to do things. But one thing you see people do all the time is there's a ditch running from a road. Now there's a road up by that building you see up there in the distance, and there's a ditch running down through, and someone's put themselves a nice little bench in. But let's say that the landowner decided, I want to fill that in. I don't want a stream. I actually want just a field. Okay. So that's been there a long time. That's, that swale or ditch has been there a really long period of time. If there's a swale running across for a field, must it be left open? Yes. True or false? What do you think? And this starts to get us to the question that Paul asked, which is a really important question about diverging streams. Well, we got a 50-50 split. Wow. I'm a little surprised by that, to be honest with you. Now, you can't just fill that in. I can tell you that right now. One of the most critical things, an easy rule to remember, is you cannot move water from one watershed to another. Okay? Now, could you put it in a pipe? you might be able to put it into a pipe, but remember, you may be getting on towards that line where you're now turning it into a concentrated flow, man-made water. You're now responsible for anything that water might do in terms of damage until it's back to a natural condition. But you can't just fill it in. Okay, that's an absolute. Here's in a situation, this occurred many years ago, and somebody had taken water upstream of this culvert pipe and they had diverted it into a stream that used to be stable and now was unstable because the volume of water was too great. The velocity of the water was too great. And every single storm, they were getting debris. And the yellow line is where the pipe is. Okay. In this particular case, it was hard. The town had a hard time going after them. They don't have full-time attorneys. But guess who does? Yes, the DEC. They contacted the DEC. The DEC went after these people who had changed the watersheds, and they got the property put back to where it had to be. Okay, so the DEC can actually be your ally, and that's one place you can go after them. If you get a private property owner who fills in a ditch, who doesn't let the water flow. Okay, and there's some other things that a highway department might be able to do, and we'll talk about those here in the rest of our time together. What it comes down to is you can't move water from one watershed to another. Anytime you are collecting water, changing watersheds, it becomes man-made water, and now you are responsible for that water until it's back to a natural condition. Okay? So neighbors who change grades and put in new discharge drainage, they've created the water, they're now liable for that situation, and they picked up the liability. If a municipality does it, the municipality picks up that liability. So again, remember the term reasonable use. Even if you want to do that, there's a need to do that. You may be able to, barring any permits, but you have to be reasonable about it. You can't just concentrate all the water and discharge it into a lake and go, we're done. Because you may have extra pollutants, you may have extra sediments, you may have a whole bunch of different things. And that's what we'll talk about in a few minutes. MS4s come into play, okay? Reasonable use works 90–95% of the time. So neighbors can't change grades and just do what they want with the water. And they can't ask you to just plug up a culvert pipe. That's no. There's a pipe that's been there for 20 years. Remember, the courts think that's natural. You can't move water from one culvert to another just because they don't like the water going there. It has to be done in a reasonable way, and it has to be done in a way that is controlled. And you may need to bring in engineering. You may need to do something beyond. Okay. Now, what can the highway department do? Well, the highway department has some rights and responsibilities. Okay. Pipe sizing, water on or off the right of way, things like that. How big the pipes are, can handle certain floods. This is a site real close to where I live here in Ithaca, the county road. The county knew the pipe wasn't big enough and it flooded on a regular basis. Okay, they knew that though. They actually designed it to be overtopped once in a while and it actually held up pretty well. The picture on the left is actually taken after the storm, the picture on the right. Now, recently they have replaced it. They got themselves a Culvert New York grant, replaced a couple of pipes in the area, much bigger pipe now. Okay, it's much larger to handle bigger storms. And we can spend some time if we want to. We could talk about the advantages and disadvantages of a project like this, but now it's going to be able to handle the bigger storms. But now what happens downstream? Are you doing it in a reasonable way? It might be considered natural flow still, but if you create a gully downstream, that's not kosher. That's not reasonable, even in a natural stream environment. So you have to make sure you dissipate that energy and you don't create problems. Much in the same way you can't pond water up onto somebody else's property either. Okay, so keep these things in mind. Now, there are equivalent laws for county, village, cities depends on their charter when it comes to riparian rights, but I'm just going to go through the town highway law portion because they spell it out pretty well. There are equivalents slightly different. You're going to want to look at the highway law specifically if you're on a county road or you're on a village street, but good rules to think about using the stuff from the town superintendent side of the house. So one of the general powers and duties of a town highway superintendent is to construct and keep and repair sluices and culverts and cause the waterways, bridges, and culverts to be kept open. Now, I went through the case law a little bit, looked at this. Kept open actually could be interpreted two different ways. It could be kept open in terms of drainage, and I'm pretty sure that's the intent, but there's enough case law that sounds like it's also keeping the road open as well. And so the idea is the highway superintendent has a duty to keep the waterways and the ditches and the streams flowing, and a duty to keep the roads and the highways open as well. So that gives a lot of power and authority for the highway official. And again, there's an equivalent for every level to do things. Now, there are other parts of the law that are useful, and you could read the highway law and spend a whole time doing it, helps you with insomnia. But there's other sections that you might want to think about. So for instance, anytime you want to cross under a roadway, especially if it's a private entity that wants to do it, they can do so. And the highway superintendent has the power to essentially allow or not allow drainage, sewer, water pipes, cattle passes, and crossings under the highway. So for instance, if you're ever driving on 206 near Green, there's actually a cattle crossing underneath the highway. That would be approved by the highway official to allow that. Should be done in a controlled way so that liability doesn't accrue to the town or the county or the village or even the state, but stays with the person who wanted to put that particular thing in. Should be permitted, should be monitored, should be put in properly. Now, when we start getting into stormwater sewers, now we're start talking about the overall town highways, the board needs to be involved. And a good rule of thumb is anytime you're doing something where you're starting to concentrate flow, get the board involved, get the municipal attorney involved. Really, really important, okay? To make sure everybody is on board and is on the same page, okay? Now, what are the drainage duties? You can slice them all you want in every section. They comes down to 4 things in New York State. Number 1 drainage duty is to protect the highway facility, okay, from damage due to drainage. You then need to safety collect and dispose of said highway drainage. Safely pass the water, and I love this part. If you read the laws, it talks about passing the water across the highways. Well, it probably should have said under, but that's what it says, across the highways. And then protecting private property for damage due to collected water being cast onto private property by the highway department. Now, I want you to understand, this is where we create a lot of confusion. People say, oh, well, that means water off the road. The highway department has to take care of it. No, it does not say that. Essentially, what it says is damage due to collected water. That's that man-made water situation. The road in of itself being there and the water running off doesn't fall into that category, at least according to most of the court cases, okay? So it's collected water. If the concentrated flow and discharged it, if it created an erosion gully, yes. But if it's just dissipating in what is considered a mostly natural condition, just a roadway, no. And the highway department does not have the power or the duty to go do repairs due to drainage that's not caused by this collected water situation. They can't go and do work for just a private entity. It has to have a public highway related purpose. Now let's say there's a ditch that needs to be cleaned out. Okay, and it's causing problems for the highway. When may a town highway superintendent enter onto private lands for drainage work? And you can actually select all 5 of these if you'd like. Let's see what y'all collect. We'll see what you get. Okay. Give you a minute or 2 to count these and read them all down. Is directed by the county highway superintendent, authorized by the town board. There is a need to protect the house. There is a need to protect the highway, or none of the above. You can select as many of these as you want. And again, there are some equivalents for counties and villages. Okay. A lot of you are saying A, B, C, and D. Some of you are just saying D. And again, the rules do change in the county system. The county superintendent can do this just under the one caveat that's important. He doesn't need to authorize himself, and he doesn't need the town board involved. He can just do it. It's a direct power for a county official. The answer here is A, B, and D. In other words, the town superintendent, if there's a drainage issue, has the ability to go off of the right-of-way when there is a need to do to protect the highway, not to protect the house. Now, if they've caused the damage, that's a different problem. But in terms of if there's drainage work to protect the highway under those 4 things, it would be D. Okay, and for a county, it's just D. But for that to happen, the town superintendent, if they can't get an agreement from the landowner, which by the way, I prefer, but if they are reluctant, then has to be authorized by the town board And the county superintendent has to review it and direct that, yep, that's going to be a needed improvement to protect the highway, not to protect a house. Okay. Now, this all falls under 147 of highway law, entry upon lands, and it specifically says the town superintendent may, when directed by the county superintendent and when authorized by the town board, enter lands to, quote, protect the highway. Okay. Now, somebody says in the Q&A, wouldn't it be applicable under a state of emergency protecting the health, safety, and welfare? If a declared natural emergency has occurred, they're doing it under that act, not under the Highway Act. Okay, that's a declared emergency. That's a different situation. And oh, by the way, any damages that occur is the liability on the town. Even if it's an emergency, you still have some liability you've picked up. You may be allowed to do it, but it has to be an emergency. Okay, a declared emergency. Otherwise, you picked up all the liability. Okay, and we won't get into what defining a declared emergency is. Okay, that's a different animal. Now, where does that right of way end? Well, first, what's a road? We got to make sure we have what a road is. So you can get a road by acquisition of different methods. And then we got to worry about what is the right of way. And I'll tell you right now, the highway law can get very confusing. It can be very complicated. And sometimes we wind up so much focus on the edges of the case that we forget the important stuff, like this fake sign that somebody, posted many years ago. And probably be better today in terms of AI, but big thing, the sign has sharp edges, don't touch the sign. And in a little text, it says also the bridge is out ahead. What is the important stuff? Well, the important stuff is it a public road? Okay, now you can obtain the road, purchase, dedication, release, you can petition, there's all kinds of ways, but we're going to concentrate on roads by use. And why? Well, 80 to 90% of the town roads are roads by use. 50 to 70% of county roads used to be town roads, so they're roads by use. And village streets have an equivalent section of law, street by prescription, and that's 70, 80%. Unless it has a piece of paper with a deed. And let's talk about that a little bit. Now, here's a picture of a town road by use. You can actually click on the picture. Where's the edge of the right of way? Where's the edge of the right of way? Let's see what y'all come up with. You can click on this. Some people are putting it in the ditch line. Some people are putting the backside of the ditch line. Some have put it up on top of the bank. Okay. Some people at the edge of the travel limits. Ooh, someone typed in there, maintained limits. And yeah, that's actually the key, is what has been used by the public and maintained by the agency. Okay. And by the way, as I said, there is an equivalent for streets in a village. This isn't a street in a village. This happens to be here on the Cornell campus. I just like the fact that somebody doing crack repair was just having a little bit of fun. But in terms of what is the right of way, here's the rule of thumb. This works, again, 80, 90% of the time, probably 95%. Look first for a deed, okay? And we're actually writing up, we've got some stuff on what is the right of way in our Community Corner series. We're actually going to put together a thing on how to figure out and find the deeds if you don't know how to do that. Essentially, the rule of thumb is you got to look at the deed at the clerk's office, county clerks. Okay, but look for a deed. If the deed has the right of way in it, that's the right of way. Otherwise, it's by use. Okay, and by use, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I want you to realize that even outside the right of way, a municipality has something called the authority to control. Okay, it's easier within the right of way, but there are some things that can be done outside the right of way. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Now, anytime you're leaving the right of way, you need to get an easement. And we'll spend some time talking about the easements. And I know you're like, there's 20 minutes, Dave. How are you going to get it all? Yeah, we're going to go pretty quick. Now, in terms of deeds, again, you're going to go down to the clerk's office. You have a piece of paper that defines the right of way. It makes it pretty easy. But by use, there has to be public use, not a driveway, not two houses. There has to be a public use. Where does that line fit? Again, court cases have ruled different things, but if there's a business, a church, a school, it's a through road, public use. A single house, couple of houses, probably not. also has to be municipal maintained. In other words, there has to be proactive effort by the municipality to maintain that. Or in the case of a village, we didn't say that it wasn't private, public. In other words, a village can just say, hey, these are private, we're going to keep them that way. The easiest thing to do is close them once a year. But again, municipal maintain, municipal control. Now, some people like to go look at the tax maps, or they use the 3-rod rule that's written into the law. Please don't do that, okay? Because it can get you into trouble. Because what is the width of a road by use? Again, you can click on here. What's the width on a road by use? Utility pole to utility pole, ditch line to ditch line, 50 feet, 3 rods, none of the above. It's not 50 feet. 3 rods would only be 49.5 feet, but it's not 3 rods either. The courts have pretty clearly said it's what's been used and maintained. Oh, by the way, it might be more than 3 rods in roads by use, which can actually be a benefit in some cases and liability as well. The utilities may or may not be inside the right-of-way. On a deeded right-of-way, they have a right to be there. Outside of one, it can get complicated. Certainly the ditch line we know is included, but if you let a tree grow up, that means you haven't maintained it, and you can lose that right-of-way in only 6 years versus 10 years to gain it. So yeah, none of the above is probably the closest answer. There's no fixed single answer. The case law is something like 20 pages in the McKinney's case law book, which you may want to look at if you combine the streets from the villages and the town highway law 189. So there's a lot of cases involved here. Now, in terms of the authority to control, I want to make sure we understand that a town or county board does have the power to control things outside the right-of-way and even within. So they can require people have a certain setback for fences and setback for sight distance in an intersection, and stuff involving drainage has to be applied to everybody, and anything that's already in place, you're going to have to grandfather them in and either pay for it or slowly change things over time. Okay, but it is allowed. It's called the authority to control, but that's a board action that has to be taken. Okay, through local laws or ordinances. Now, in terms of the right-of-way, all kinds of things can affect the right-of-way and change what's in the right-of-way. Your ditches, your culverts, trees like that. So we'll just pick on a few of them real quick in our time together that are important from a drainage law standpoint. Obviously, the ditches. If you've got good evidence you've been maintaining to the backside, yep, there's your right-of-way. So in this particular case, and we'll see if my pen decides it wants to work today. You've got pretty good evidence you could justify to the backside of that with no problem. Whether you could go all the way up to those trees, if you don't need to maintain it, document that, hey, we didn't need to maintain this bank that we cut 20 years ago. Make that part of your daily log, make that part of your record. You might be able to gain that right of way to the top of the bank. Not that you want to do much work, but you don't want somebody putting something in there that can create problems for you. Okay, so keep that in mind. Where the ditch goes off the right of way, where does it end in terms of a public part of the highway right of way? Boy, that's a good question. Good rule of thumb, think about where it no longer benefits the highway. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't benefit it going all the way down to a natural stream, but if it's no longer helping the highway from a drainage standpoint, drying it out, it probably isn't a part of the right-of-way anymore. It's now part of a drainage easement, and you may need to have a drainage easement if you're going very far off the property. In this case, you can actually see where the stream actually goes down. It actually goes down over there. Okay, the highway portion of it really almost stops about here somewhere. Exactly where? Well, that's why it's really good to communicate with people and why it's challenging with roads by use. I mentioned culverts. You actually have the right to the end of the culvert. And if you clean out the ends on a regular basis, you may gain that as well, but you got to document it. In terms of going upstream or downstream, putting in big pipes and drainage and stones and things like that, you're off your right of way. You're going to need easements to do that. You can't just go up there. Even if you say, well, it's a highway purpose, if you're far enough away, you're probably not reasonable. Ask yourself, is this reasonable? And you'll probably be okay. Now, this is not a drainage law thing, but remember, we always actually talk about the importance of communications, safety, and drainage as well. And so I have to do my safety pitch. Trees, you lose the right of way, as I mentioned. Do me a favor, when you cut the tree down, please cut it flush. This is just a liability and a half. Please try to not leave things, a fixed object, anywhere near the roadway, in or outside the right of way. There's nothing about that that's good. Now, how do we get permission to do all this work? You know, you're thinking, well, okay, we got a little sense of where the water's going, who's got the rights and responsibilities. Well, let's talk about 4 things that are really important for getting permission. Now, this is one, again, not drainage law, but we shouldn't forget about it. I know all of us probably know about 811, but you got to call before you dig, okay? Call 811, give them a couple of days, get your marks out there, go out and look at the marks. If you put out white marks for where you want to dig, maybe a survey mark with your pink paint, and then you've got these other colors, and they tell you something. So it's one of the reasons why we really should be careful about what paint we use, because if I see a red mark, I'm thinking I got electricity. Gas is yellow, don't like hitting gas. Communications lines, fiber optic cables, water lines, reclaimed water like an irrigation system, and sewer. I don't like hitting sewer either. But call ahead of time and make sure it's the excavator who calls. If you hire a contractor, they call. If you're a municipality, if you're doing the work yourself, you call, okay? But still try to be safe. You've seen me show this picture before. This was a reclamation machine. It was destroyed because they hit a gas line that wasn't where it was supposed to be. So before you do any digging, call, okay? Now, in terms of drainage, you're almost assuredly going to need a permit. Now, I say New York State DEC permit, really it's permits for anything you're doing drainage related, okay? Now, of course, we have the New York State DEC regions, but DEC permits, they can include all kinds of things. There's protections of waters, corrosion, coastal erosion, stream protection, water quality certificates, freshwater wetlands, tidal wetlands, wild and scenic recreational rivers, and a little bit we'll talk about speedies permits. This is just a quick list. I went through the list of all the DEC permits, and I picked out the ones that were water related. There are plenty of others out there that I couldn't even possibly list. Now, they've changed things. You know, at one time we had a single form, you filled it in and it went all the way around to everybody. Now you do something called a joint application form. And you actually check off which agencies you're going to send it to. The 4 that are included in the form are the New York State DEC and Department of Environmental Conservation, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The New York State Office of General Services is included, and the Department of State. What is no longer included, by the way, is Adirondack Park, Catskill Park, those kind of things. You may have to send separate things out. There may be local organizations you have to deal with. So communicate, talk. That's going to be your best bet to making sure you're in good shape. Now, I just want to briefly remind you of SPEEDIES, the State Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Essentially, this is for point sources, not highway sources, for point sources. Now, if you concentrate flow, you may need to do a SPEEDIES permit, but it's for point sources, traditionally private, commercial, and industrial, though again, a municipality who has a point discharge might need to do this. This is where EPA phases 1 and 2 come into play, where we're concentrating water, and we'll talk about phase 2 here in just a minute. If you have a beaver, okay, you got beavers, you can't just go take the beavers out. You're going to have to get a permit to do that in a lot of cases, and you may need to think about some kind of beaver leveling device. Okay, if you're interested, we actually have one from the Town of Niles. It's actually one of our Better Mousetrap winners that you might want to look at. It's pretty cool. And then, of course, I want to end up our discussion before we do our quiz for MS4s. That stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Systems. And the idea is we're concentrating flow. We almost need to treat that as if it's a point source, and you need to manage it. And there's a process involved. Okay. Now, there are programs for urbanized areas for small MS4s. And the DEC does have the power to designate certain areas as part of a small MS4s. Now, this is an old map, surprisingly hasn't changed much, okay, of urbanized areas. So everything you see that's in that magenta color, those are going to have MS4s automatically, and then any surrounding areas might be added. And there are potentials for lots of smaller communities at the ends of lakes, small cities, things like that. If you need to know in your particular area, go onto the web. That's one of the links in the handout, the Stormwater Interactive Map. You'll have to zoom in. I zoomed into Tompkins County, okay? And it shows you the areas that are automatically MS4s. You can actually click on other things such as protected streams and things like that. I just chose the MS4s on the map. It's a pretty cool website. Make sure, however, you turn layers on and off. When I did this, I had Tompkins County, I turned on the county boundaries, and you can't see where the MS4 boundary is. But essentially, anything that's got even a little bit of that darker brown is part of the MS4. So let's see if I get my pen working here. I don't like the color, though. Let me get a different color. Let's try, let's see, we'll do that color should work. So essentially, because it does a good job here, because it just touches the MS4 boundary for Tompkins County includes most of the towns of the county, but not a couple. Oh, sorry, missed it. There we go. So 2 towns, three towns, Danby to the south, Enfield to the west, and Groton to the north aren't part of the MS4, but the other ones are, because even if there's a little bit, it's included in the MS4 area. Now, if you want more information about MS4s and pollutants and stormwater, what I'd say is come to one of our workshops. We actually are offering our stormwater class this spring, talking about some of the changes, and there are changes. There's always going to be changes. Keep looking for that. And you can see we've got stormwater management in large parts of the state. We're going to be down in, got to get my pen back on here. We're going to be down in Suffolk County. We're going to be over here in Columbia. Come on, pen, please write. There we go. Up in several places all over the state. So you're going to be able to get to within an hour, pretty much a workshop. So please sign up and we can talk a lot more. Jeff Scott will do a good job leading you through all of the issues with stormwater, which are something to think about. So let's have a few problems and then our quiz. We have a problem here. This is a drainage law problem. Had we seeded this, had we put in some grass, no problem, we're good. We're back to natural conditions, everything's fine. But because we didn't seed it, now we've got an erosion problem. We picked up that liability because we constructed it. Okay, we can't fall back on the, well, it was natural. No, it was natural. You dug it up and you didn't put it back to a semi-natural condition. You're liable for any of the downstream erosion or sedimentation that occurs. And by the way, it's also money that you've got to pick up and bring topsoil in to replace. Okay. Now, this wasn't done by a highway department necessarily. It might be part of a construction site, but if you're in an MS4, you need to be watching for these things. All of this erosion, all of this material, got to be kept on site and should probably be better in terms of control. Okay. Because what we don't want is this. Now we got all this debris and material. It's in our storm sewer system, and now we've got to deal with it. Ugh. Okay. So these are the kind of things to look at. Or this one you see way too often where they put silt fence in a stream. If you install a silt fence properly, it actually traps all the silt and you actually create more problems than you solve. There are other techniques, discharge basins, retaining things, and better yet, get some vegetation there. Don't let everything erode away. That's always a best bet. In terms of easements, you're going to need to have an easement. Anything that's you're going to be back to do repairs on it, you need a permanent easement and you need to go through your municipal attorney. So get ready to raise your hands. How many of you know your municipal attorney, town, county, whatever level? Raise your hand if you know your municipal attorney. I hope at least half of you do. And not quite half of you. You should know that municipal attorney, okay? Now, there are attorneys with the DICOM, there's attorneys with the Association of Towns, NYSAC, and all that, but you really want to know your municipal attorney. You should know them very well. And remember, if it's something you're going to be back, that's a permanent easement, not temporary. Temporary is things like storing equipment or dumping some ditch cleanings properly, okay? So let's do a little quiz, get you out of here. Okay, ready for the quiz? Some of these are repeats, so we'll see how y'all did. What is your biggest drainage law concern? Y'all talked about liability, discharge, responsibility. I hope we've covered most of the things you've got there. We haven't, please throw them into the Q&A. Okay. So let's just see how you did. New York State law is derived from which of the following? And I'll see what your answer is in a second, but common law, civil law, reasonable use. What you said when you did it before, most of you voted for common law. You were pretty good. Very good. Nice job. We use reasonable use as the driver today, but the derivative was common law. Okay. So that's where the basis comes from. So if there's a question about is this reasonable or not, at least here in New York State, they're going to go back and look at the common law requirements of how we treat the water. Okay. But try to make sure that you think of it as natural. A stream underneath a road is always considered a natural water course. True or false? Well, y'all voted before mostly for true, but if I give you a new choice, I add in 3 choices. What do you think? And this is fun because I'll let you put your answers in before I show the results. And some people are putting them over into the podcast. Okay, I'll give you 5 seconds. Yeah, I'll give you 10 seconds. We got time. Okay, let's see what y'all came up with. And the answers y'all came up with, most of you said depends. Yeah. If I only give you 2 choices, most of the time it's probably going to be true. But there's always those edge cases. If you're not sure, just ask yourself, is this reasonable? If you're resetting an existing pipe and there's no evidence of problem, you don't have a bank flow problem, you're probably okay. And by the way, the courts typically will say it's natural first. They'll start from that standpoint. One way to help you overcome this is go down to your local soil and water conservation district office. They do aerial photographs every 10 years. Yes, they're electronic these days, but you can go see how the drainage patterns have changed between that and the USGS maps and get a sense of how long it's been there. And if it's been there for 20 years, yeah, it's probably going to be considered natural. So I'm hoping most of you know your soil and water conservation district. If not, get to know them. Definitely a resource you want to add to your pile. So could a municipality reset this pipe without a permit from the DEC? Would that be a true, false, or depends? Ask yourself the question, and I'll show you what you had for the answer in just a second. Okay, and yeah, it's going to depend. And again, if it's an emergency situation, you probably can reset it, but think about what would the requirements be if you were not in an emergency and try to do those as best as you can. Before you said true, and yeah, it is most of the time going to be true, but again, there's those edge cases. A swale running across the field for many years must be kept open. True or false? And again, I hope every one of you has got in your head, the answer is most of the time going to be true. Okay? It's not a false. You can't just fill these things in. You might be able to put into a pipe, but you're then probably going to be concentrating the flow and picking up the liability. And by the way, if a homeowner wants to do it, make sure they do it in the right way. Otherwise, it could become a municipal problem. Okay? When may a town highway superintendent enter upon private lands for drainage work? Okay, think about the answer to that one, and here's what y'all came up with before. Oh no, that's right, we did it. You can we vote. That's right, we said it. So you can vote. See if you get the 3 of them that are the correct answer. And yeah, there's some weirdness with emergencies, but yeah, nice job. Yeah, when directed by the county superintendent, authorized by the town board, when there's a need to protect the highway. Yeah, okay. What's the width of a road by use? Well, it's not utility pole to utility pole. It's not ditch line to ditch line. And it's not 49.5 feet. It's really none of the above. And this is what y'all did last time. And yeah, none of the above. It depends upon the situation. The utility pole and ditch rules are pretty good starting points. But if you get a tree growing up, if it wasn't maintained, that can change things. I'll tell you right now, the best thing to do if you've got a road by use is try to work with people. And yes, I know some people will not work with you, but we got to do what we can do in a reasonable way. MS4 stands for, let me see if you get this one right, material sediment and storm sewer systems, municipal separate storm sewer systems, mini storm sewer systems suck. Maintenance of sanitary and storm sewer systems are none of the above. And let's see what y'all had for responses. Okay, very good. Okay, nice job. Okay. And nobody just had to go for the humorous answer. Now, this is the end of our webinar on drainage law. I hope I answered your questions. You're welcome to throw a question in while I just remind you of upcoming activities. We finished drainage law. Next week will be worker safety, and then we'll have another 4 after that are worth PDH on liability, culverts, work zones, and pavement maintenance. We'll then be starting into our workshop series. But remember that our work zone workshops will be starting up next month. Go on the website, look it up, and try to figure out how we can come see you. And if we don't see you before, maybe we'll see you on a webinar at a highway school. And with that, I'll get rid of the 2 things there and just say thank you. Any questions? Get 30 seconds. Otherwise, Amanda's going to close this down because we're running ahead of schedule. Doing a highway law course, drainage and right of way. Yeah, sure. Time is our biggest enemy, but we can look at all those things. Okay. Well, everybody have yourself a good day. It's been a cold day. The snow stopped here in Ithaca, so we can go out and make ourselves a snowman. And yes, thank you, David and Amanda and Jody in the background. And everybody have yourself a great week, and see you on another webinar in the future. Bye-bye.